Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing Little Red Riding Hood Uncloaked, the evolution of a fairy tale. I'm Pat Zerke. For 37 years, Cambridge Forum has been bringing you live public discussions of the issues and ideas that are shaping our world. From the werewolf trials of old Europe, through the court of Louis XIV, to modern feminist writing and Hollywood movies, Little Red Riding Hood and her friends, Grandma, the wolf, and the woodcutter, has had a long and adventurous life. How has their story changed over the centuries? What does this story of a little girl lost in the woods say to us today? And what does it say about us? With us is Catherine Orenstein, a freelance writer based in New York City. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the San Francisco Examiner Sunday Magazine, and Ms. Magazine. Her recent book, Little Red Riding Hood Uncloaked, Sex, Morality, and the Evolution of a Fairy Tale, is the focus of our discussion. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Catherine Orenstein.
Hi, thank you so much. Before I begin, I just wanted to say I was looking over the reading list that Pat gave me, and I was just noting how much scholarship fairy tales generate. And that didn't used to be the case, and I was looking at one of the books, as The Uses of Enchantment by Bruno Bettelheim, which it's almost 30 years now since that was first published, and really sort of transformed the way that we think of fairy tales as something serious and full of deep, important truths about the human experience, as something an important place where children can explore forbidden ideas or the inner psyche. I really don't do that in my book. I'm much more interested in the small details of fairy tales and how small changes can reflect interesting changes in interesting details and truths about how we change, not necessarily these deep archetypal truths. So, a girl, a wolf, a meeting in the woods. Who doesn't know the story of Little Red Riding Hood? She's the age-old star of bedtime drama, a symbol of childhood innocence. She is every girl next door, every damsel in distress. She debuted in Walt Disney's first animated cartoon in 1922, 6 years before Mickey Mouse. And she was Charles Dickens' first love. I felt that if I could have married Little Red Riding Hood, he once declared, I should have known perfect bliss. Little Red Riding Hood is told on every continent in every major language. Barnes & Noble sells more than 100 different editions, including one diagrammed in American Sign Language. It's the first story that many adults ever heard, and odds are it's the first or one of the first that we'll read to our own children. But few of us know the story as well as we think. Over the years, scholars have piled an entire cosmos of meanings on this small girl's shoulders. Some call her tale a seasonal myth, an allegory of the sun swallowed by night, or the personification of good triumphing over evil. Her basket of wine and cakes, it's said, represents Christian communion, and her red cape stands for menstrual blood. Some see the tale in Freudian terms as the ego overcome by the id. Others see it as symbolic of the relationship between man and woman. And inevitably, the tale has been a vehicle for imparting sexual ethics in keeping with the social fabric of the time. Tellers have manipulated the plot to portray a seduction by a temptress, the rape of a virgin, or the passage of a young girl into womanhood. The plot is powerfully simple. Opposites collide, good and evil, beast and human, male and female, and how the heroine negotiates this clash determines her fate. And thus, over time, Little Red Riding Hood has become a quintessential moral primer. But what morals does the story teach? Many, it turns out, and not always the ones we remember. The heroine encounters a wolf, or a werewolf, depending on the version you're reading, and he hides himself in grandmother's bed. In the earliest written version of the tale, the girl strips off her clothes, joins the beast under the covers, and dies. A rhyming moral at the end warns young women to watch out because a man can be a wolf, popularizing that term, still common today, to mean a seducer. In later versions of the story, a hunter or woodsman comes to the rescue, imparting the revised moral that a good man, a father or perhaps a husband, can save a girl from her folly. With his knife or sometimes scissors, he cuts her free, lifting her from the belly of the beast as if from a bad dream, and giving her a second chance to walk the straight path through life. In modern versions of the story, which echo themes of the earliest known oral folktale, the girl escapes on her own, teaching that women can save themselves. She carries her own pair of scissors or tricks the wolf with a clever ruse, or sometimes she fights. The plucky red leather-jacketed heroine of the 1996 movie Freeway, based on the Red Riding Hood plot, wrestles her wolf-like stalker to the floor and kills him. Alternatively, in some modern revisions of the tale, Red kills the hunter woodsman, or is killed by him. As for the story's main characters, their roles shift and sometimes dramatically flip-flop. Traditionally, the wolf represents evil. That is why we need prisons and policemen, says a version of the tale published in New York in 1916. The British illustrator Walter Crane famously drew the wolf in sheepskin, a biblical reference to the devil. And peasants who told the story in France's old regime called it a bzou, a sort of demon or werewolf. And that was because in that time there had been a series of sensational trials of men for supposedly transforming into wolves. But the wolf is not always evil. Indeed, surprisingly often, it's Red who's in the moral wrong. In the tale told at Versailles, she is unchaste. In Victorian versions, she is cast as disobedient. And some even blame Little Red Riding Hood for perpetuating the fear of wolves that has led to their persecution and near extinction. "Get your hands off that endangered species," yells the woodsman to Red Riding Hood in a version of the tale that's circulating on the internet. And what about the heroine's innocence? Drawn with rosy cheeks and dimpled kneecaps, the storybook heroine is supposed to embody childish naivete and illustrate the age-old parental adage, "Don't speak to strangers." But in popular culture, Little Red Riding Hood has grown up and become an ode to lust. In the wartime cartoons of Tex Avery, she performs a nightclub striptease for a very excitable wolf. Anyone who's familiar with the cartoons of Tex Avery knows that he was a master at creating visual metaphors for sexual excitement, and his wolf's eyes pop out and fly across the room. His tongue unrolls like a long red carpet, and he has a tendency to levitate and stiffen up at the sight of the heroine. Meanwhile, on Madison Avenue, Red Riding Hood is frequently depicted in advertisements as a femme fatale with a Mona Lisa smile. "I'm on my way to Grandma's house in my little red hurts," reads a 1962 ad that ran in the New Yorker. Without Red, Nothing Doing read a 1983 ad for Johnny Walker Red Label Scotch, which showed a wolf bypassing a crestfallen girl clad only in white. And my favorite example, a poster-size ad for Max Factor's Ripe Young Riding Hood Red lipstick that ran in Vogue magazine in 1953. The ad shows a femme fatale dressed in red applying lipstick in the middle of a forest. In the background, a pack of Rock Hudson lookalikes peep out from behind the trees, flashing a set of comically lecherous grins. And the ad copy promises that the lipstick shade will bring the wolves out. So much for the warning about not speaking to strangers. So, sometimes our heroine is a helpless prude in dire need of a man, but today she's also the namesake of a lesbian dominatrix porn star, Little Red Riding Crop, who cracks her whip and obviates the centuries-old need for either seducer or savior. And sometimes the wolf is just a man being a man, as Sam the Sham and the Pharaoh sang it circa 1966. "Hey there, Little Red Riding Hood, you sure are looking good. You're everything a big bad wolf could want. Ow!" But sometimes the wolf is just a man being a woman, as cartoons of the cross-dressing villain point out. A 1989 Far Side cartoon by Gary Larson has the beast on a psychiatrist's couch. "It was supposed to be just a story about a little girl and a wolf," he says, "but off and on I've been dressing up as a grandmother ever since." Little Red Riding Hood's perennial popularity is due in part to her ability to adapt to the times. Every year, reincarnations of the story pop up in print, on television, on billboards and advertisements, in children's games and adult jokes. But for all her ubiquity, most people today remain remarkably oblivious to the tale's origins and underlying meanings, with sometimes comical results. In 1990, 2 California school districts banned the story because of an illustration showing Red's basket with a bottle of wine as well as fresh bread and butter. The storyline of Red disrobing and climbing in bed with the wolf passed muster. But the wine, they said. The wine might be seen as condoning the use of alcohol. Thank you.
Now joining our discussion of Little Red Riding Hood and the Evolution of a Fairy Tale is Harvard University's John L. Lieb Professor of Germanic Languages and Literatures and newly Dean for the Humanities, Professor Maria Tatar. Professor Tatar is the editor of the Annotated Classic Fairy Tales, a beautifully illustrated edition that came out last year. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Maria Tatar.
Thank you. Katie's book has been such a breath of fresh air in folklore studies, so I'm just delighted to be with her tonight. And I can only add some footnotes, and I thought I'd just say a few words about the broader context for stories like Little Red Riding Hood. And to my great astonishment, I was gratified to see that we think along the same lines, because I wanted to start also with Bruno Bettelheim's book, written some 30 years ago. And the publication of that book, The Uses of Enchantment, was a great moment in fairy tale research, because suddenly here was a figure of great intellectual stature, a high-powered figure, who was taking these stories seriously, who was saying that they were worth paying attention to, analyzing, and studying. The title of Bettelheim's book was deeply symptomatic, The Uses of Enchantment. What he was doing was drawing attention to the magic of fairy tales, something that we are all aware of, the enchantment. They are a source of magic, but he was also telling us that the stories have a pragmatic function, the uses. And for Bettelheim, the stories had a great therapeutic value. They helped children work through anxieties, and once they had finished reading the story, Bettelheim told us the child would be happy and healthy and sound and safe. He had a very optimistic, almost a utopian view about fairy tales. I wanted to say a few words about another function for the tales, and that is that they seem to me a kind of portal for literacy, a portal for many children for reading, because there's a real excitement about these stories. Graham Greene tells us, what do we ever get nowadays from reading to equal the excitement and revelation of those first 14 years? The books that we read in those first 14 years, obviously not quite 14 because we don't do much reading in the first couple of years, but in our childhood, the stories that we read in our childhood have a powerful effect on us, shaping our social identities, shaping our cultural identities. Greene uses these terms, excitement and revelation, which I think are really key. Excitement tells us something about the way in which fairy tales can produce a somatic response. I'm sure many of you can remember visceral reactions to the story of Little Red Riding Hood, to the terrors of that story, or to the relief that you felt as a child possibly when the girl came out of the belly, or the anxiety that you felt if you read the French version in which she never makes it out of the belly of the wolf. So these are stories that really take us into other worlds, into parallel universes. Tolkien tells us that these stories give us fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. And that word consolation, I think, is really important. It tells us, it refers to the happily ever after ending. But remember, and Katie's pointed this out in a wonderful op-ed in the New York Times, fairy tales just give us that happily ever after in a single line usually. In the rest of the tale, we have ogres, wolves, monsters, stepmothers, giants, and nothing but conflict, struggle, trauma, and violence. So we don't have what Wordsworth called the sweet serenity of books. You remember his line about the love of learning, the sequestered nooks, and the sweet serenity of books. But instead we have something very different. Something that Richard Wright talked about in his autobiography, his account of growing up in the Jim Crow South, in a book that I'm sure many of you know, Black Boy, where he describes the experience of reading a fairy tale, actually having a fairy tale read to him by a school teacher. And the fairy tale wasn't Little Red Riding Hood, it was the story of Bluebeard and his 7 wives, really an adult tale, and a tale that his grandmother caught him reading with a school teacher, and the horrified grandmother referred to the story as devil's work. Devil's work, and I think in a way she was right, because fairy tales and these kinds of stories do provide children with a portal to knowledge. And ever since Eden, of course, knowledge has been associated with the devil, with the serpent. And in fact, Wright describes the experience of reading the fairy tale in terms of exposure to forbidden knowledge. Here's what we find in his autobiography. My imagination blazed. I burned to learn to read novels, and I tortured my mother into telling me the meaning of every strange word I saw, not because the word had any value, but because it was the gateway to a forbidden and enchanting land. So this new world opened up to him, the kind of world that we hear about in Moby Dick when Ishmael embarks on his journey and tells us, I love to sail forbidden seas and land on barbarous shores. So these tales can be seen as providing knowledge, providing children with knowledge about adult secrets, adult mysteries, about what goes on in an adult world. And they also stimulate a desire for understanding, for learning more, for getting out of the world of childhood. Children often use books like these to get out of this phase, whereas we as adults sometimes use stories like this or childhood books to get back into the world of childhood. So there's a funny kind of way in which we're at cross purposes when we're reading together. The child's trying to grow up, and we're hoping we can recapture our childhoods. Excitement was the one term that Graham Greene used. The other was revelation. And you can see how these stories can be used by children as ways of navigating reality. Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher, tells us that the fairy tale teaches children to meet the forces of the mythical world with cunning and with high spirits. And in fact, many versions of Little Red Riding Hood do exactly that. They show us a trickster heroine who manages to outwit the wolf. But many of those stories have been lost to us. So the version that we read now has a hunter come to the rescue. Another German philosopher writes about Hansel and Gretel in the following way. What proves itself is courage and cunning. Consider yourself entitled to be totally happy. Dare to make use of your power of reasoning. Look upon the outcome of things as friendly. These are the genuine maxims of fairy tales. And this is Ernst Bloch, who had also a utopian view of fairy tales and what they can communicate and teach to children. What I basically wanted to, the point that I really want to make is that while these tales have the powerful utopian element, the one thing that I firmly believe they don't do is to send a single message that is the same for every child. We have William Bennett's Book of Virtues, which is an anthology of children's literature, and before each story, we get one line, which gives you the message that Bennett finds in the story, so that if you open that volume, you discover that there's the story of the three little pigs, which has the following lesson. The child will learn how to use the right tool to get the job done right. Which is not a message that I ever took out of that particular story, and I think it's unlikely that anyone here in that room decided that that was what that story was all about. But these are stories that do provide children with wisdom about the world, and it never comes in the form of a one-liner. There are also stories that teach children you can use your wits, you can survive, you can triumph in the end. You have that happy ending, that catch of the breath, that beating of the heart that comes with that moment that you know that everything will turn out all right. And this is, I would say, the one requirement for a children's story, that in the end, the child does survive and does triumph over the odds. This is one reason why I prefer the Grimm's collection for all their violence, the versions in which the stepsisters' toes and heels get cut off, to, say, the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen, where, remember the little match girl who dies at the end, and in Andersen's version, the little mermaid also dies in the end. So these are stories that help children come back home, either come back home or establish a new world somewhere out there. And as Katie has pointed out in her book on Little Red Riding Hood, these are stories that we never really discard. And she points out that we internalize them. And not only do we internalize them, but we're constantly recycling them in our culture so that you do get all those wonderful versions that are described in Katie's book. Thank you.
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Catherine Orenstein and Maria Tatar discussing Little Red Riding Hood Uncloaked, the evolution of a fairy tale. I'd like to ask you both to follow up a little bit on the discussion of the purpose and the audience for the fairy tale. Catherine, you, in describing the various incarnations of Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf over time, make it very clear that this was not always a story for children. In fact, it was very rarely a story for children. And could you talk a little bit more about the different audiences that the various Red Riding Hood tales have been intended for?
Sure. You know, the fairy tales for children, it's a relatively modern creation. And I look at that a little bit, but not so much in my book, because originally fairy tales were told for a broad age group of people, and they still really are. They still permeate our daily life. They're still part of adult culture, even if we today tend to think of them as children's stories. The first published fairy tales that were called fairy tales were penned for the court of Versailles and for the salons in Paris in the 1680s, 90s, early 18th century too. And they were political and social commentary. Many of the tellers of fairy tales were women, but the most famous is Charles Perrault, and his collection of 8 stories contains little parables about aristocratic life, about the social and sexual and political currents running through the end of the 17th century. Little Red Riding Hood, for example, was a chastity parable, and at the end of the 17th century, to see the wolf, to have seen the wolf, avoir vu le loup, was slang for losing your virginity. It was something that was common in the slang then, and it's still common today. We still use the term wolf to mean a womanizer. And his story, like most of the fairy tales of that day, was aimed at adults, although the definition of an adult would have been different then as well, because people married so young, and a girl of 12 was marriageable. Nonetheless, aimed at mature aristocrats who would have read the symbolism of his story quite clearly. Of course, it's done a little bit tongue-in-cheek. nonetheless, it's a story about a girl who climbs in bed with a wolf, who disrobes and climbs in bed with a wolf and is eaten. In his version, there's no salvation. And it came with a very explicit rhyming verse at the end of his story that explained the tale in very clear terms as being a tale about young women, watch out for the lecherous noblemen of Versailles. There's a popular English translation that goes like this: little girls, this seems to say, never stop upon your way. Never trust a stranger friend. No one knows how it will end. As you're pretty, so be wise. Wolves may lurk in every guise. Handsome they may be and kind. Gay and charming, never mind. Now as then, 'tis simple truth. Sweetest tongue has sharpest tooth. And there was a reason for a story like this in the Court of Versailles, just as many of the fairy tales had underlying reasoning beneath them. At the end of the 17th century, Versailles was this French aristocratic culture was famous for its seductions. But at the same time, this was an age that paradoxically prized chastity in unwed women. And that was because of arranged marriage. Marriage at the end of the 17th century for the upper class was a way of advancing yourself financially and socially. It was controlled entirely by parents. And if a young girl were to elope or to be abducted or seduced or raped or any number of things, all of these were a direct threat to the family welfare. And in fact, there was a particular crime. It was called rapt, and it correlates both to seduction and abduction. They would both qualify, and both of them were considered not crimes against a girl necessarily, but against her parents. So this is the context that Perrault's Little Red Riding Hood came out of, and this is the subtext, the social subtext that his sort of funny, tongue-in-cheek story is tapping.
The werewolf trials, they wouldn't have been, a warning at the Court of Versailles, but that was clearly another case of an adult audience in an early story. Who is the audience for some of the more modern Little Red Riding Hood stories? For example, you write at length about the film Freeway. Who is the audience, and what is the message there, do you think?
When I think of fairy tales, I think of them not so much as always as stories, but more as a set of symbols, a set of it's a symbolic vocabulary that gets rearranged to tell different stories. Freeway, it starred Reese Witherspoon, and the plot it's the Red Riding Hood plot, but sort of modified. So she's on the freeway on her way to Grandma's trailer park. So that's the setting, and she meets Kiefer Sutherland plays Bob Wolverton, who is a therapist / serial killer, which I think is a great modern metaphor for the wolf in sheep's clothing. And it really was, I thought it was great. I thought Reese Witherspoon did a fantastic job. It was one of her kind of breakout movies, all very violent. And it has a twist at the end, of course, and I doubt I'll be spoiling it since now it's 7 years old. She beats the wolf. And it's not just it's not really a straightforward kind of sort of feminist reinvention of the story. It's really turning the whole story on upside down, because really what it's challenging is these ideas of sweetness and happily ever after, and the idea that things work out right in the end, the system works out right in the end, because really it's a challenge to not just the Bob Wolvertons, but also in the movie the police don't believe her because she's trailer trash, and so this particular message has been reinvented. But this is just one of so many reinventions of the fairy tale. Maybe
add anything, Maria?
I had been thinking about the way in which these tales functioned as sometimes the television and pornography of an earlier age, so that actually we have Perrault, who is writing the story down for the first time at the end of the 17th century in a way that is actually very different from the oral stories that were in circulation at the time, which give us bawdy versions of the tale, with Little Red Riding Hood performing a striptease in front of the wolf, and some versions that were recorded by folklorists go into great detail there. So one has to think about these stories. I mean, I talked about them as stories for children, but in another time and place, they were diversion, entertainment for adults, very clearly for adults who told the tales while they were spinning, taking care of household chores, doing all kinds of dull things that needed the rhythms of storytelling. So unfortunately, many of those versions are lost to us. We have some that were recorded fairly late in the 19th century. But fortunately, since folklore is conservative, doesn't change much over time, those 19th century versions give us a pretty good idea of what was going on in an earlier age.
I just want to follow up on that. You said something very interesting. You said you looked at these stories as the pornography and the entertainment of the era, of an earlier era. I was struck in reading your book, Catherine, how many of the modern appearances Red Riding Hood makes are in our new visual culture. It's not a literary retelling of the story. It's a movie, it's an advertisement, it's a poster, it's a television appearance. I mean, could you say something about this low culture, high culture split and where the fairy tale fits in, how it weaves the two together and maybe breaks them apart?
That's several questions wrapped into one, isn't it? Why is it so visual? Why are fairy tales visual? I think they really are visual, particularly one like Little Red Riding Hood, which is so focused on the color. She's identified by the color of her outfit, which, by the way, is something that's common in a lot of fairy tales, to be identified by something so visual, either your hair or your Puss in Boots or any number of things like that. And it is even in narrative form, it's a visually imaginative form, the fairy tale. We're constantly seeing images, and so it's not at all surprising to find it in billboards or television, easily adaptable in that way. As for the pornographic aspect of your question, I was really intrigued. I came across one particular pornographic rendering of Little Red Riding Hood that opened that door for me. It was called The Punishment of Red Riding Hood, and I thought it was hilarious. The video box cover showed this dungeon scenario with a woman in a sort of boobless red Merry Widow being sort of whipped by these two other women. And I just found it very strange. And then I read the distributor's plot description, which said that it was a lesbian bondage epic, which culminated with one of the characters being, quote, whipped and clipped on the dreaded overhead donut. Which to me was just fantastic. I mean, I'd never seen dreaded and donut used in the same sentence. And also just what was a fairy tale doing in this form? And so I watched it. And then I did an internet search, and I actually called up the distributor of that video, and I found that there was a booming subgenre of fairy tale pornography. And they were all very clever, very, very funny. I'm sure that some of you won't be surprised by this, but I found it just endlessly entertaining. Cinderella in Chains, Alice in Bondage Land, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, spelled B-A-R-E-S, and it just went on and on and on. Little Red Riding Crop. And I started to notice, first of all, I was fascinated with the breadth of it all. And then I started to notice that so many of these, the fairy tale porn narratives were bondage, S&M, B&D, kind of fetish. They were all in the actually, it was the distributor who pointed it out to me that these all fell in the fetish category. Cinderella, there was one with the whole shoe fetish one based on Cinderella. And that also was very funny. And then eventually I stopped laughing and I started to say, well, why? You really have to come up with some kind of understanding of why. And really, it seemed to me that explained a lot about the fairy tale to me, that fairy tales are about obedience and disobedience, about socialization and transgression. And those things, and the way that those things are sort of defined, the carrot and stick, is sexual desire and social desirability or not desirability. You're either the one who gets married in the end, you're the chosen one, you're the one who wins the kingdom, or you're the witch or the one who's terribly punished with snakes coming out of your mouth or whatever it is. But anyway, social and sexual desirability being sort of played off of this idea of obedience and transgression, socialization and transgression. And that really, to have such a lesson from a porn video was really quite something for me. I think there was another part of your question. I think I only answered two.
Katie, let me ask you, what about the fact that these are stories for children and that we think of them as innocent stories? What about that connection between the erotic and the innocent? Is that part of the charge, or?
Well, it's funny. I mean, of course, in the context of our conversation here, we know that fairy tales are not just about innocence and not certainly for children, but the idea that they might be about something, about innocence or the possible perversion of innocence or the threat to innocence, the idea that that's exciting, both in the sense of being sort of frightening and also perhaps sort of erotic. Sure, I think fairy tales are charged with that.
You're listening to Catherine Orenstein and Maria Tatar discussing Little Red Riding Hood Uncloaked, the evolution of a fairy tale. The floor is now open for your questions if you would use the microphone in the aisle.
It was mentioned that fairy tales can shape a child's identity. I wondered if it's possible for fairy tales to shape a nation's identity, and I'm thinking of Germany. As I understand German fairy tales, they sort of promote fear of the outsider, I think. I don't know that much I can't remember that much about them. But could a national identity be influenced or created with fairy tales that, for example, make children concerned about outsiders and so on? And as an example, specifically, 20 years ago I heard Helmut Schmidt, who was Chancellor of Germany, explain that to understand Germany, you had to understand that Germany had more neighbors than any other country, and that if Germans had not behaved the way they did, there would be no Germany in the middle of Europe. It would have been absorbed by all the neighbors. I wondered whether consciously or unconsciously the Germans are being conditioned to behave that way.
It's an interesting question because the Grimms, when they decided to go about collecting fairy tales, preserving them, in the early part of the 19th century, they did this as part of a cultural mission. That is, they believed that these were the remnants of folk poetry. They called it Volkspoesie. And what they wanted to do was put that culture between the covers of a book before it was lost, and then use the book itself as, they called it a manual of manners for children. So it was meant to educate children, and also to model behavior for them, so that one could analyze that could analyze the stories in the collection as tales that were intended not only to shape a cultural identity, but national identity as well. Yes, thank you.
You know, there's something just to add on to that, the idea that fairy tales can shape a nation. I think they always do. I mean, can anything else really? I mean, it's really the idyllic story that we tell about ourselves, whether you're telling it in sort of the Kennedy Camelot story, or whether you're sort of doing the reality television version of it, where everyone is sort of jockeying for their fairy tale wedding, which, by the way, I think the Tristan Ryan wedding, the quote-unquote fairy tale wedding, is supposed to be tonight, isn't it? That big reality TV wedding. In any case, yes, I think these kind of, not just the Grimm stories, but our modern reinventions of fairy tales do shape our national identity.
Yes.
How it shapes it seems a question to me, since I think the the danger of a wolf in the forest could be literally the danger of a wolf in the forest coming out of the background of the story. I mean, there are dangers in the forest. There are dangers from wolves and other animals in the forest. There are generalized dangers in life that you got to watch out for. And then there's the sexual danger that you're, directing this into. And it seems that, in the case of the modern idea of a wolf, I mean, it wasn't sort of in the old days necessarily a sexual thing, perhaps, even though it had this losing your virginity, thing. But in the story, the Little Red Riding Hood is not attracted to the wolf. I mean, it's not a dangerous attraction. The Little Red Riding Hood thinks the wolf is her grandmother. And then I think as I remember, it's like, what big eyes you have, the better to see you with, and so on, to what big teeth you have, the better to eat you with. And as you go through this, it seems to me, I can imagine, I don't know if I can remember, but I can imagine a kid thinking, no, it's a wolf, don't be so innocent. And this is like, it's like a blamable innocence. You're not cautious enough, seems to me, what's going on here. And it can be applied in a sexual way, but it can also be applied in a way to wolves, literally, and the forest, and just to life in general. And those are have a sort of separate characters. So it's not, the story is it seems all over the place. And you're taking the sexual aspect in a way that is not quite in the original story, in a way that, I mean, we when we think of a wolf, we do think of this dangerous attraction, and you're tempted, and then you might cross the line, or you might be incautious in a particular way, which is not necessarily what the story is about. I wonder if the red cloak has to do with making yourself a target, making yourself conspicuous. And I also wonder why it's a riding hood. She doesn't ride.
Wow, that's a lot of questions. First, I just want to point out that in between the what big eyes you have and what big teeth you have is what big arms you have, and the reply is the better to hug you with. I think that what you're saying is still correct, that there's a lot of ambiguity in this story, and that to some audiences and for some people, and in some cases explicitly, in some cases not at all, it has a sexual meaning. Certainly there are huge audiences that don't read it that way. And I think that that's part of the power of not only this story, but fairy tales in general, their pliability, their elasticity, and their ambiguity. The Riding Hood is an English, it's a tidbit of English history. The Red Riding Hood was the iconic garb of the 19th century countrywomen. And my sister-in-law happens to be a dress historian, and she researched particularly this item of clothing for me. And it's the one item of clothing that can be considered iconic for 19th century or early 19th century, I guess not only then, but particularly then, England, Scotland, Wales. And it appears in all different sorts of paintings of that time. It's almost always red.
I thought the story was German.
In German it had a different name, but you're asking why the Riding Hood, why the Red Riding Hood. It acquired that name in England, in its English retellings, where that garment was a particularly ubiquitous garment.
So it wasn't Little Red Riding Hood originally?
Well, what was the German name of the story?
Caption, it's Little Red Cap. And in French, it's Le Petit Chaperon Rouge, just the little red hood.
Oh. Thanks.
I just wondered if you wanted to add anything about that, Maria, about the
it's interesting.
Sexuality.
I think, as one tries to puzzle out the meaning, the deeper meaning of fairy tales, and we're talking about sort of the way in which they shape our identities and all of that, I did want to just point out that sometimes we don't know what the effect of a story is on a child. I always remember reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe with my daughter, and for years she was obsessed with Turkish delight. There's that moment in the story when the child gets this candy called Turkish Delight, and that was the story for her. That was the most important element, and it stayed with her. And for years, she wanted to try this magical candy, and finally found it at Formaggio, I think, and was deeply disappointed by the fact that it was not as great as she thought. But sometimes it is odd the way in which there's a detail in the story, the Red Riding Hood, which stays with us when we read it as children, and when we read the story as adults and try to figure out what it means. This is why I think Bennett is so wrong with the one-liner idea, because, think of it. There are so many different interpretations of Little Red Riding Hood. My guess is that there are as many valid ones as there are people in this room, just as there are thousands of versions of Little Red Riding Hood in our heads. We think of all the literary versions and the stories that were told once upon a time, but in fact, today we would each tell the story in a slightly different way. We would remember different details, focus on different moments.
I'd like to ask, while you go to the microphone, would you just list, Catherine, the constant elements in the story as it has moved across time and cultures?
I don't know, really.
Red seems to be one of them, the color red.
I would say a girl, a wolf, a meeting in the woods. But even these things are not constant. The red is not always there. It's not there in the early oral folk versions that folklorists have pieced together. It's not always a wolf. In some versions in Asia, it's a tiger, grand aunt tiger. Girl, it can be a girl, it can be a woman. Freeway doesn't take place in the woods. The movie starring Reese Witherspoon, it takes place on a highway. The disguise, the wolf in disguise, and the threat of being eaten. Well, I'd say actually that seems to me a constant. The threat of being eaten. The rescue, that's not constant. But there are a series of events that happen, and we recognize the story by the presence of some of these events or some of these characters. And if there's enough of them, we tend to think of it as, okay, that's the Red Riding Hood story.
So is it relationships that are constant as opposed to things?
The minute I say something, I'm immediately thinking of exceptions. But I would say that there is even sort of a fairy tale structure that folklorists have pieced together. And if you go along that, you would say, okay, there's an absenting from home. Someone leaves home. There's a meeting with a dangerous force, an enemy, or possibly an enemy. There's
villainy. Yes,
there's villainy.
Transgression, interdiction. One folklorist has described 31 different functions to the tale, and not every tale has all 31 functions. But I think you've captured it. One can think of this in terms of the motifs in the tale. Sometimes folklorists think about the different narrative moves. But the constant does seem to be, I think you've captured it in a girl, a wolf, an encounter in the woods. The innocent and the predator. The David and Goliath story. Well, we have this story in myths. The fairy tale gives it to us in an up-close personal form, though. So it's inflected slightly differently.
Your question.
Yes, I'd read that Professor Tolkien of Lord of the Rings fame believed that fairy tales were little fragments of much larger and more coherent stories that existed once upon a time. And, much as kids playing that game Operator, we keep whispering the message down and it gets more and more garbled, that we were down to just little sort of fragments or artifacts, as you were, of these earlier larger tales. I was wondering just if you had any opinion on that theory.
That's exactly how the Grimms put it. That is, they saw the stories they collected as fragments of a larger, of earlier narratives. I mean, the assumption then is that there is one original story that had it all and that was perfect in some way. I think actually all we've ever had are variants. That is, there is no sort of Urmärchen, as the Grimms called it, a kind of archetypal form, an ideal type, or anything like. We've always just had these wonderful variants. So, I guess I would disagree. Although I agree with Tolkien on most matters that have to do with fairy tales. That's the one moment where I would disagree. Katie.
Well, it's interesting because fairy tales. Often it's been pointed out that fairy tales can be sort of fit into a larger hero myth. They tend to be this sort of central episode of a larger hero myth, or they can be anyway. They don't always have to be, but anyway, that's been pointed out, and I found that really interesting because they do tend to focus on a particular episode in the creation of a heroic identity, which is the journey and the encounter with danger and the successful negotiation of some sort of test, physical, psychic, whatever. But I've also, my other response to that is that I've heard those kind of things said, and my immediate reaction is that myths are so frequently spoken of as sort of the greater masculine sphere, and fairy tales are sort of the domestic feminine sphere, and I hate to hear it sort of diminished and sort of spoken about as something small and less meaningful or less full or complete. And Sherry Ortner has pointed this out a little bit about like myth and fairy tale. It's the same reason why we call men chefs and women cooks. Not that we all do, but there's sort of I'm always sort of wary of that, particularly because I'm a woman reader and I'm writing about a female fairy tale character. And I'm so wary of in any way belittling the fairy tale.
Thank you for your comments in your book. It seems like you have a kind of a chaotic theory of meaning or quantum theory, because every time you get a sense of the story, it shifts, and you have to sort of scrap it and adopt another interpretation that you're offering. So I mean, the story has lost some of its impact on me because I can't quite get a track on it. And then when it comes to fairy tales in general, it seems what happens to them when Disney gets a hold of them? They become so saccharine and diminished in a sense, and they lose their forcefulness. So I wondered if you had any ideas about how storytellers or writers or fairy tale creators can sort of recover the force and the power of fairy tales in a modern context.
Mm-hmm. Let me answer the first question first. My universal theory of fairy tales, to bring it all together. I tend to think of the fairy tale as a collective conversation, something that's constantly changing. And in order to give a sort of unified, coherent, like this is the way it is, answer or story about any particular fairy tale, you have to really limit yourself in time and place and say, this is what it is here and now. And that's really the way I approach it. More broadly, I don't think there is any one interpretation that I would say is always true of the fairy tale. If that were so, it would be deeply boring. And about the reclamation of fairy tales, I never really think of Disney as such a danger. I've never really found the Disney versions of the fairy tales so enticing, and I also am not as impressed by the Disney World kind of phenomenon, because I see fairy tales everywhere all the time. Particularly because I write about them, but I see that there's Freeway out there, or I see, for example, this week there was an opening in the Museum of Modern Art in New York by the artist Kiki Smith, who treats Alice in Wonderland and Little Red Riding Hood in these very dark, unique, complex, weird, funny ways that are sort of the antithesis of anything Disney. I don't know. What would you say, Maria?
Avoid Little Red Riding Hood. It does. It is odd that
I think that the answer lies somewhere in the fact that Tex Avery, who was Disney's contemporary, embraced Little Red Riding Hood more than any other fairy tale character. For him, he did many, many versions of Red Hot Riding Hood or Wild and Woofy or whatever. He called them lots of things, and he had such a great time with that fairy tale. For him, the wolf and the girl quickly leapt out of the fairy tale and became his sort of guiding characters in this sort of caricature of courtship, sort of salacious but very funny. And I don't know. I never even wondered why Disney didn't do Red Riding Hood.
It's not the length.
You did say that the first animated feature Disney did was Little Red Riding Hood, though we haven't seen it.
That's true. It was called Grandma Steps Out, or at least that's the name that a British distributor gave it. But it's not one of his sort of big Disney reinventions. It's a very sort of short, it's a line drawing. It actually turned up. Somebody found it in their, I guess it came up at a garage sale or something. People magazine did a story about it some years ago, which is how I found out about it. Because it had been, thought to be lost for many years. And it's not typical, it's not mature Disney at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, your question.
Throughout history, something that I've always noticed is there's kind of a cycle of exoneration and repudiation of subcultural aspects. Like there'll be a group of people who will be exponents of certain ideas, and then they meet dissent from the majority and things like that, like sexual taboos and stuff like that. That always becomes, like when you're talking about the pornographic fetish things, like that's not going to be accepted into any kind of a mainstream culture, but it comes up and then it's kind of denied. To what extent do you think that the fairy tales offer sort of a mid-ground forum to have the depravity of these stories given in a sort of tepid version? That way they can be household stories at the same time.
Maria, do you?
Well, let's see. I guess one could think about not just this pornographic dimension, but the subversive edge to the stories. That is, it seems to me that something like Little Red Riding Hood might have been avoided by Disney because there was a sort of awareness of this girl going into the woods, disobeying, engaging in some sort of transgressive action. And I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't also some awareness of those earlier stories in which Little Red Riding Hood is a trickster and outsmarts the wolf. Certainly in some rewrites of the Little Red Riding Hood story, I think of Lois Lowry's Number the Stars, where you have a child who is a resistance fighter. She actually manages to defeat the Nazis who have their police dogs, the wolves, and she goes out into the woods and delivers a basket of goods to a boat that is being used to transport Jewish refugees. Okay, so Little Red Riding Hood, and actually that's not the only example of a story in which she becomes a resistance fighter in our culture. So it seems to me that there are times when, there are certain elements to this story that may not be explicit in some versions, but that suggest a certain subversive power. The wits and cunning that I referred to earlier that can be used to turn the tables on the ruling powers. So that I think that edge and that subversive power of the story is something that makes them slightly intimidating. And certainly not always easily Disneyfied.
In addition, I was also going to comment on a version of the story that I had heard, or that I had actually read a couple of years ago, in which the mother told the daughter over and over again before sending her out into the woods when she had the basket with the bottle of wine, do not break the bottle of wine, and that was stressed over and over again. And that to me seemed like a real brazen metaphor. and you didn't mention the story, but I'm sure that you ran across it at some point in time. But I just thought I'd mention that also.
But yeah, there's been all sorts of symbolic meanings sort of attached to the wine, whether it's her virginity or something else. But one thing that's interesting about that is whenever there's a warning not to do something in a fairy tale, it really foreshadows exactly that thing happening. You can be sure it will happen. Don't speak to strangers. Don't break the bottle.
An invitation to transgress almost, yes.
Oh, you were talking about Disney and how he sugarcoats everything. And I really think that Sondheim in Into the Woods does not sugarcoat. And I wish I could quote from Little Red Riding Hood's song, but she has so many wonderful little twists and questioning and is this way or that way? And I just thought maybe you wanted to comment a little bit on that.
I'm a big fan of Sondheim, and I love Into the Woods.
Yeah.
I particularly, one of my favorite, he has a great way of capturing in really simple, witty ways the contradictions or the dark underbelly of fairy tales. And my favorite line from that was when one of the, I think it's Sleeping Beauty or Cinderella, catches the prince, being unfaithful, and he says that he was raised to be charming, not sincere.
And also the wolf also plays one of the princes as well.
Could you use the microphone?
No, I'm sorry, I can't stand up.
Well,
We can hear you.
Can't hear me back there?
It's the radio that needs to hear you.
Oh, I see. The importance of the grandmother has been overlooked. Did she become introduced at a later stage after Red Riding Hood had been conceived?
I agree. I think the grandmother is often overlooked.
Is she just simply a tool for the wolf?
I don't think she's a tool at all. It's interesting that she has not come up so far in this conversation. You're right, she's been overlooked. I think that she's an important part of the story, and there's been a lot of scholarship and thought about, particularly in the early oral version, because that story is slightly different, of what the grandmother represents. For me, and this is just a personal interpretation, I like to think of it as sort of the coming of age and passing on wisdom and passing on experience, and all of these characters are wrapped up. If one character is going to come of age, then you have to have another character bringing her there to sort of balance the story. In the original oral version that folklorists have sort of pieced together, folklorists trace the evolution of stories the same way that paleontologists trace the evolution of species by collecting many samples and attempting to date and compare. And they have collected many versions and created a sort of master story that is thought to be representative of the original oral tale. And in that story, it's Red Riding Hood is going to her grandmother's house, and the wolf gets there first, and it's a sort of body story that involves cannibalism. The wolf actually kills the grandmother and puts her flesh on a plate and her blood in a bottle of wine, and Red Riding Hood then eats and drinks her grandmother. And to me, when I read that, I think of it as somehow sort of being a parable of what you are and who you are, and that really you are, you are the flesh and blood of your ancestors. But of course, that's wide open to lots of other interpretations. But that's what I think of when I think of this story. And particularly because the oral story ends differently from the literary versions that most of us know. The oral story ends with the girl cleverly tricking the wolf or the beast and getting away. And so I like to think of that story as a story of not just passing on blood and flesh, but also sort of wisdom and feminine intuition or whatever things might be wrapped up in that story. What do you think of that, Maria?
I think you've said it all there. I mean, it's a great story because it has all three generations present and works through those generational conflicts and the passing on of wisdom. Yes.
You have one more question?
Can comic books be considered fairy tales? And returning to the concept of shaping national identity, I read some time ago that many of the Superman-type comic books, superhero types defeating evil, were created in the 1930s by Jewish refugees of Germany who were hoping to mobilize or inspire American youth to prepare for war. I don't know if you're familiar, if that's correct. That's what I recall. And would you consider comic books as fairy tales or modern fairy tales that could be used to shape a national culture?
Well, you could think about them as a form of folklore, certainly, because Superman, for example, I suppose, is there an original, a first Superman comic, the sort of Superman, was sort of given rise to all of these recycled versions of the story. So Superman, I would say, has started to operate like folklore in our culture, and in that way they would be the same. But I think the structures would be slightly different. I guess I would see Superman as closer to the mythical realm, and the fairy tales tend to be what Katie described as the more domestic versions, up close and personal, taking place in the family, showing us the conflicts of family life, whereas Superman is clearly dealing with other issues.
You could argue, though, that the purpose of the Grimm's fairy tales was to promote domestic homogeneity or cohesiveness as opposed against the other, whereas the later
creating
comic
certain
books
shared values,
were designed
yes,
to promote imperialism. For example, the Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back. In other words, maybe it's not, I don't know that much about it, but I just thought maybe it's a different context. One is promoting one type of behavior, and another is promoting international.
I think it's important to look at the ideological dimension, certainly, and with Superman that would clearly be the case. With fairy tales, there's also that ideological dimension which is inflected slightly differently, and where I think the Grimm's collection really is about shaping values,
and nationalism,
creating common values.
But since you mentioned ideology, it occurs to me that you might see the Grimm's fairy tales as promoting nationalism, whereas Superman is promoting internationalism, maybe, which is what we're doing
That's
now.
a good way of putting it. Yeah.
I'd like to ask one last question, kind of to wrap up. Toward the end of the book, Catherine, you claim the fairy tale is, in essence, a human code that we ingest in the form of a story. And I would like you to unpack that statement a little bit, and what do you mean by it? What is encoded in these stories that endured for centuries and spoke to peasants in 16th century France and England, and speaks to us today in 21st century America?
I think what I meant by that is it's certainly nothing. It's not surprising to think of our physical bodies as being modified and different and changing, and yet continuous with the physical bodies of our ancestors many, many, many years ago, that we're part of something that is enduring. But we don't often think of our stories that way. Maybe folklorists do. I mean, of course folklorists do, but we tend to think of our stories as things that have a beginning and ending in the here and now. And one of the things that I do in my book is bring together many different versions of a story to show how it's changed and adapted over years, across cultures, across languages, and how we're also connected by stories, and that we have a cultural legacy, a sort of cultural DNA that we also pass down. Not that it's always the same, not that it doesn't change, not that it doesn't adapt, but that there's a legacy that goes way back, and that in these stories, the persistence of these stories tells us that there are deep meanings embedded in them. What are those meanings? That's a little bit harder to answer, but if you think about what a fairy tale talks about. It talks about the most central concerns of human experience: growing up, growing old, lighting out in the world, the relationship between generations, between daughters and mothers, daughters and fathers, daughters and grandmothers, and between women and men and boys and girls. And then it also assigns value to these relationships: good and evil, socialized, not socialized, wild, the home, the sphere of domesticity, and the wild, sexually desirable and not desirable. These are the sort of judgments and the sort of interpretations that are running through these stories, and these stories, in a way, are defining narratives that get passed down to us over and over and over again, and they're ways that we are that we're bonded together. They're collective narratives, collective conversations that are constantly adapting, but that are also reining us in. It's a cultural legacy.
Where are the boys in fairy tales? Are we missing them? They used to be around. There used to be 3 sons, and the youngest son was the one who ultimately became the hero. But are boys and fairy tale heroes dropping out of our culture?
You know, the Grimm's collection had more boys in it. The original collection had more boys in it than girls, more men than women. But the modern collections don't usually contain all of the 212 stories that were in the original Grimm's collection, and the editing process tends to favor stories with women. And I find, particularly if you think about it, you know, the women are really in the modern focus on fairy tales. They've sort of become these morality stories aimed at women, and the men are just metaphors for punishment and reward. You know, behave and you'll meet a prince, misbehave and you'll meet a wolf. While the women sort of act out these symbolic, this symbolic behavior that lets us know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. But it's certainly not always. This is not always the case, and it wasn't the case with the Grimms. It hasn't always been the case with fairy tales, and certainly there are lots of stories that don't involve women or don't have women as the central characters. And in fact, I was thinking about this. Maria talks about some of the simple the simple hero, the James and the not James, the Jack and the Beanstalk, and some of the simple male heroes who are actually, you know, they're quite different from the female characters.
Yeah, it was quite fascinating. There are 2 produced sociologists who have just published an article in Gender and Society about the way in which, in the Grimm's collection, beauty is the main attribute of the fairy tale heroines. That again and again you have figures who are described as being, looking like a picture, looking like a beautiful portrait. So that's the main value attached to women. But the 2 sociologists didn't look at the male figures, and they think that it's just terrible to have these stories in which beauty is the prime value for girls and for women. But if you read the stories, you discover that almost all of the boys are the youngest of 3 sons, and inevitably the stupidest of 3 sons. And so they're positioned in a way that, of course, they manage to rise above that. They manage to use their wits. In the end, they triumph through the use of their wits, so they overcome all of that. So it would be interesting to, I think, investigate some of the asymmetries, some of the gender asymmetries in folklore, and try to understand how that operates. The difficulty with that analysis is that in fairy tales, surfaces count, so that beauty always signifies goodness, and ugliness always signifies some kind of unfairness or a deep character flaw. lack of virtue. The villains are always ugly. So you have an aesthetics that is problematic. And I think we need to identify that and think about that, but also think about it in very broad gender terms and not just focus on one attribute and one side of the equation.
So where are the boys in modern fairy tales? Are they just, elided by editors of today? And will they come back, or have they all moved over to Star Wars and Luke Skywalker and a more modern version of the heroic, legendary form?
They have been edited out of the children's fairy tale, the sort of classic fairy tale that we think of. They have been. Collections have been edited in favor of female heroines. I think there's a folklorist who has written about this, and I was really impressed. She actually collected some of the numbers of editions of fairy tale collections and how many of the stories, what percentage were devoted to women heroines, and how they'd been over the years selected in favor of these sort of stories. So they have been. Fairy tales have become a more and more feminine genre, at least the classic fairy tales. So where are the boys? I think that they've migrated into different sorts of stories. Or new stories have been created for them, like Harry Potter. The genres are a little different. I think, the Matrix or Luke Skywalker from Star Wars, or these kind of stories are hero figures that aren't sort of classic fairy tale. They're more mythic heroes. But definitely the male characters have found different venues.
One of the great things I think about Little Red Riding Hood is that is a story that boys can find exciting and interesting, and Luciano Pavarotti has a wonderful introduction to a version of Little Red Riding Hood in which he describes the power of that story for him. So it's not it is a female protagonist, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's just for girls. And I think that young boys will often identify with female characters. It's not unusual. But it's interesting, too, because we have lost the male Cinderellas. In some cultures, there are female Cinderellas and male Cinderellas. And if you look at collections of European folklore, occasionally you do find a male Cinderella figure. But there is a way in which the editors have tended to favor female heroines, or female protagonists.
But you don't see this as a threat to the universal appeal of fairy tales. It sounds like fairy tales will continue to have this universal appeal and will continue to speak to boys and girls, men and women across culture. Am I understanding you right?
Oh, I think not only will they, but they have to. I mean, that's really that's why they survive. That's why they exist. I mean, they exist to address important, central, exciting, disturbing, whatever concerns. As the minute they stop doing that, something else would take their place, and that would be the new fairy tale. That would be, the next version of Freeway, or the next Kiki Smith, or the next crazy reinvention of the fairy tale that maybe doesn't seem like a fairy tale at first, but then, after some time passes, you realize that that's its newest incarnation.
Okay, thank you, Catherine Orenstein, and thank you, Maria Tatar.